Chapter 1. Did I hurt you? No. Are you angry with me? No. It was true. At that time, everything was true, for he was living in the moment, without questioning anything, without trying to understand, without suspecting that one day he would need to understand. Not only was it all true, it was all real himself. The room. Andrée still lying on the ravaged bed, naked, thighs spread, a thread of sperm seeping from the dark patch of her sex. Was he happy? If anyone had asked him, he would have said yes, without any hesitation. It had not occurred to him to be angry at Andrée for biting his lip. That was part of it all, like everything else. And he stood, also naked, in front of the wash basin mirror, dabbing at his lip with a towel moistened with cold water. Is your wife going to ask you any questions? I don't think so. Does she ever ask any? The words hardly mattered. They were talking for the pleasure of it, as one does after making love. Bodies still flushed with sensation and minds slightly dazed. You have a beautiful back. A few pink stains dotted the towel, and in the street an empty lorry bounced over the cobblestones. On the terrace, some people were talking. A few words were audible, here and there, without making complete sentences or any real sense. Do you love me, Tony? I think so. He spoke in jest, but without smiling, because he was still patting his lower lip with the damp towel. You're not sure. He turned around to look at her and was pleased to notice that semen, his semen, in such intimacy with his companion's body. The room was blue, washing blue, he had thought one day. A blue that reminded him of his childhood. The tiny muslin sachets of blue powder his mother dissolved in the washtub water for the final rinse. Right before she went to spread the laundry out on the gleaming grass of the meadow. He must have been 5 or 6 years old, and often wondered through what miracle the blue color could turn the laundry white. Later, long after the death of his mother, whose face was already fading from his memory, he had also wondered why people as poor as they were, dressed in patched clothing, attached such importance to the whiteness of their linen. Were those things going through his mind at that moment? He would find out only later. The blue of the room was not just washing blue. but the sky blue of certain hot August afternoons as well, shortly before it turns pink, then red in the setting sun. It was August, the 2nd of August, late in the afternoon. At 5 o'clock, gilded clouds, as light as whipped cream, began to float up over the train station, leaving its white facade in shadow. Could you spend your whole life with me? He had hardly noticed her words. They were like the images and odors all around him. How could he have guessed that this scene was something he would relive 10 times, 20 times and more, and every time in a different frame of mind, from a different angle? For months, he would struggle to recall the slightest detail, and not always of his own free will. For sometimes others would demand it of him. Professor Bigot, for example, the psychiatrist appointed by the examining magistrate, would keep after him about it, studying his reactions. Did she bite you often? A few times. How many? All in all, we only met 8 times at the Hôtel des Voyageurs. 8 times in 1 year. In 11 months. Yes, 11, since it all began in September. How many times did she bite you? Maybe 3 or 4. During intercourse? I think so. Yes. Yes. No. Tuda actually. It was afterwards, when he had withdrawn from her and was lying on his side, looking at her through half-closed eyelashes, the light spilling all around them, delighted him. It was hot outside, in Place de la Gare, and hot as well in the hotel room, bathed in sunshine, in a heat that seemed alive and breathing. As he had left a gap some 20 centimeters wide when closing the shutters over the open window, they could hear the sounds of the little town. Some were like the murmur of a distant choir, while others, such as the voices of the customers on the terrace, were closer, crisp and distinct, a little earlier, while they were both lost in wild love-making. Those sounds had reached them and become one with their bodies. Saliva, sweat, the whiteness of André's belly, the darker tone of his own skin, the blue of the walls, the diamond-shaped sunbeam cutting the room in two, a shifting reflection in the mirror, and the odors of the hotel, which still smelled of the countryside, of the wine and spirits served in the main room, the ragu simmering in the kitchen, even the slightly musty fiber stuffing of the mattress. You're handsome, Tony. She said this to him every time they met, always when she was still lying there while he moved around the room, looking for his cigarettes in the pocket of his trousers flung across a straw-bottomed chair. Are you still bleeding? It's almost stopped. What will you tell her? If she asks about it, he shrugged. Couldn't see why that should worry Andrée. Right now, nothing seemed important to him. He felt good, in tune with the universe. I'll tell her I bumped into something. My windshield, say, from breaking too suddenly. He lit his cigarette, which had a special taste. When he reconstructed this conversation, he would remember another distinctive smell among all the others, the smell of trains. A freight train was maneuvering behind the engine sheds, and the locomotive occasionally blew short blasts on its whistle. Professor Bigot, short, thin, with red hair and thick, unruly eyebrows, would press him further. Did it never occur to you that she was biting you on purpose? Why? Later, Maître de Maurier, his lawyer, would bring it up again. I think we might be able to use these bites to some advantage. But again, how could he have thought about such things when he was completely caught up in experiencing them? Was he thinking of anything at all? If so, then he wasn't aware of it. He was answering Andrée off the top of his head, carelessly, in a light, teasing tone, convinced that such words had no weight and would therefore leave no lasting impression. One afternoon, during their third or fourth assignation, after telling him that he was handsome, Andrée had added, "You're so handsome that I'd like to make love with you in front of everyone, in the middle of Place de la Gare." He had laughed, but hadn't really been surprised. When they were in each other's arms, he didn't mind keeping some slight contact with the outside world, with sounds, voices, the flickering light on the walls, and even footsteps on the pavement, the clinking of glasses on the terrace tables. One day, a brass band had marched past, and they'd had fun making love to the beat of the music. Another time, when a storm had sprung up, Andrée had insisted that he throw the window and shutters wide open. Wasn't it a game? In any case, he had seen no harm in it. She was naked, lying across the bed in a deliberately provocative pose. She made a point of behaving as provocatively as possible as soon as she entered the room, sometimes after they had undressed. She would murmur with an obviously feigned innocence that was all part of the game. "I'm thirsty. Aren't you thirsty too? No. You will be later. Ring for Francoise. Why don't you? And order something to drink. Francoise, the maid, was about 30 and had been working in cafes or hotels since she was 15, so nothing surprised her. Yes, Monsieur Tony. She called him Monsieur Tony because he was the brother of her employer, Vincent Falcone, whose name was painted on the front of the hotel and whose voice they could hear on the terrace. You never wondered if she might have behaved this way through some ulterior motive. What he was living through, a half hour, if that, just a few minutes of his life, would be broken down into images, detached sounds, peered at through a magnifying glass, not only by others, but by himself. Andrée was tall. That wasn't obvious. On the bed, but she was 3 or 4 centimeters taller than he was. Although she was a local girl, she had the brown, almost black, hair of people in Italy or the south of France. A startling contrast with that smooth white skin gleaming in the light. She was amply proportioned, a little heavy, and her flesh was voluptuously firm, especially her breasts and thighs. At 33, he had known many women. None of them had given him as much pleasure as she had, an animal pleasure, complete and wholehearted, untainted afterwards by any disgust, lassitude, or regret. On the contrary, after 2 hours spent seeking the maximum of pleasure from both their bodies, they would remain naked, prolonging their carnal intimacy, savoring the contentment they now felt not only with each other, but with everything around them. Everything counted. Everything had its place in a vibrant universe. Even the fly perched on Andrée's belly that she watched with a satisfied smile. "Could you really spend your whole life with me?" "Sure. Really sure." "Wouldn't you be a little afraid?" "Afraid of what?" "Can you imagine what our days would be like?" Those words would crop up again as well. So lightly spoken today, so threatening in a few months. We'd get used to it in the end. He murmured casually. Used to what? To us. He was candid, innocent. Only the present mattered. A virile male, a highly sexed female had just enjoyed each other to the full. And if Tony ached a bit afterwards, the pain was healthy and satisfying. What do you know, the train's here? It wasn't Tony who'd spoken, but his brother, outside, intrigued. Tony had gone automatically to the window, to the slit of blazing light between the shutters. Could anyone see him from outside? He didn't care. Probably not, because the room must seem dark to those outdoors, and as it was one floor up, only his torso might show. When I think of the years you cost me, I cost you, he replied playfully. Who was it who left me? They'd been in school together from the age of 6. Only after they were both over 30 and married to others. Answer me seriously, Tony. If I became free, was he listening? The train had arrived, invisible behind the white station, and passengers were beginning to appear through the door on the right, where a man in uniform was collecting the tickets. Would you free yourself too? Before leaving, the train blew its whistle so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else. What did you say? I'm asking if, in that case. He had turned his face halfway to the blue of the room, the whiteness of the bed, and André's body. But something he saw out of the corner of his eye made him look outside again. Among the anonymous figures, men, women, a baby in its mother's arms, a little girl dragged along by the hand. He had just recognized a face. Your husband. Tony's expression changed in an instant. Nicholas. Yes. Where is he? What is he doing? He's crossing the square. He's coming here. Straight here. How does he seem? I can't tell. He's got the sun behind him. Where are you going? For Tony was collecting his clothes, his shoes. I can't stay here. As long as he doesn't find us together. He wasn't looking at her anymore. Wasn't interested anymore in her. Her body. What she might say or think. In a panic, he darted one last glance out of the window and ran from the room. If Nicholas had come to Trient by train while his wife was here, it was for an important reason. It was cooler out in the dark staircase with the worn steps, his clothes over one arm. Tony headed up one floor, then down the corridor to a half-open door at the end, busy changing a bed in her black dress and white apron. Francoise looked him up and down and burst out laughing. Well, here's Monsieur Tony. Did you have an argument? Hush. What's going on? Her husband. He caught you. Not yet. He's coming towards the hotel. He dressed feverishly, listening hard, expecting to recognize the shuffling footsteps of Nicholas climbing the stairs. Go and see what he's doing, then come and tell me. Quick! Tony was fond of Francoise, a brisk, sturdy girl with laughing eyes. And she returned the feeling. Half the ceiling was on a slant. The wallpaper had a pattern of pink flowers, and a black crucifix hung over the walnut bed. In the blue room as well, a smaller crucifix hung over the fireplace. He had no tie, and his jacket was down in the van. The precautions he and Andrée had been taking for almost a year were suddenly proving useful. Whenever they met at the Hôtel des Voyageurs, Tony left his little van in Rue des Saules, a quiet old street running parallel to Rue Gambetta, while Andrée parked her gray Citroën 2CV in Place du Marché, more than 300 meters away. Through the dormer window, he could see the hotel courtyard with stables at the end, where some hens were scratching for food. On the third Monday of every month, a livestock fair was held in front of the engine sheds, and many country folk still came to Trient in horse carts. Francoise came back upstairs in no hurry. Way, he's sitting on the terrace and he's just ordered a lemonade. How does he seem? He was asking the same question Andrée had. He doesn't seem like anything. Has he asked about his wife? No. But from where he is, he can watch both exits. Didn't my brother say anything to you? That you should slip out the back and go through the courtyard of the garage next door. He knew the way, going over a wall 1.5 meters high. He would be behind the garage Charon, with its petrol pumps lined up on Place de la Gare. And from there, an alley led to Rue des Saules, coming out between a pharmacy and the Boulangerie Patin. Do you know what she's doing? No. Did you hear any noise in the room? I didn't listen for any. Francoise didn't much care for Andrée. Perhaps because she was fond of Tony and felt jealous. You'd better not go through the ground floor, in case he goes to the toilet. Tony imagined Nicholas, with his bilious complexion and eternally sad or grumpy expression, sitting at a table on the terrace with his lemonade when he should have been behind the counter of his grocery store. He must have had to ask his mother to take his place while he was off in Trient. What reason had he given her for this unusual trip? What did he know? Who had told him? Did you never think, Monsieur Falcone, about the possibility of an anonymous letter? The question had come from the examining magistrate, Maitre Diem, a man so shy it was disconcerting. No one in Saint Justin knew about our affair, or in Trient either, aside from my brother, my sister-in-law, and Françoise. Andrée and I were careful. She used to enter via the little door on Rue Gambetta, which opens onto the foot of the stairs, allowing her to head up to the room without going through the cafe. You're sure about your brother, of course? Tony could only smile at that question. His brother was like another self, and your sister-in-law as well. Lucia loved him almost as much as she loved Vincent, in a different way, naturally, like the two of them. She was of Italian parentage, and family came before everything else. The maid. Even if Françoise was in love with Tony, she would never have sent an anonymous letter. Diem had to look away, and the sunlight gleamed in his untidy hair. There's still someone, he murmured, who, don't you see, remember the words you recalled for me during our last interview. Would you like the clerk to read them back to you? Tony flushed, shaking his head. It isn't possible that Andrée. Why not? But that still lay far ahead. For the moment, Tony was following Françoise down the stairs, trying not to make the ancient steps creak. For the Hôtel des Voyageurs dated back to the days of the stagecoaches. He paused a moment in front of the blue room, but couldn't hear a thing. Did that mean Andrée was still lying naked on the bed? Françoise led him down the corridor and around a corner, pointing to a small window opening onto the sloping roof of a shed. There's a pile of straw. On the right, it's quite safe to jump. The hens squawked when he landed in the courtyard, and the next moment he was scaling the wall at the far end to find himself in a clutter of old vehicles and bits of machinery. A white uniformed pump attendant was filling up a car in front of the station and never turned around. Tony slipped away to the alley, which smelled of stagnant water at first and further on, of freshly baked bread, thanks to a ventilator behind the baker's oven. Finally, Rue des Saules. He slid behind the steering wheel of his lemon-yellow van, on which black letters spelled out Antonio Falcone Tractors, Agricultural Machinery, Saint Justin du Loup. A quarter of an hour earlier, he had felt at peace with the whole world. How to describe the deep uneasiness that had come over him? It wasn't fear, for he had had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Weren't you concerned to see Nicholas walk out of the station? Yes. No. A little. Because of the man's nature, his habits, the way he was always worrying about his health. To avoid crossing Place de la Gare, Tony went the long way round to reach the road to Saint-Justin. Near a bridge over the Ornéo, an entire family was fishing in the river, including a little girl of 6 who had just landed her catch without any idea how to get it off the hook. Parisians, no question. In the summer, they were everywhere. There were some at his brother's hotel, and a little earlier, in the Blue Room, he had recognized their accent on the terrace. The road ran past wheat fields freshly harvested 2 weeks back, past vines, past meadows, where the tawny cows of the region were grazing, their dark muzzles almost black, some 3 kilometers along. Saint-Séverin was just a short street with a few farms scattered around it. Then he saw, to the right, Bois de Sarel, a small wood named after the hamlet hidden behind the trees in September of the previous year. It was here, a few meters from the unpaved road, that it had all started. Tell me about the beginning of your liaison. First the sergeant, then the lieutenant of the gendarmerie in Trient, and then an inspector of the police judiciaire in Poitiers had asked him these same questions before he met with Diem, the thin psychiatrist, and his lawyer, Desmarais, all in preparation for his interrogation by the presiding judge of the assize court. The same words were repeated for weeks and months by other voices in other places, while spring turned into summer and summer into autumn, the real beginning. We first met when we were 3 years old, because we lived in the same village, and we went to school. Then we made our first communion together. I'm talking about your sexual relations with Andrée Despierre. Did they begin before what? Before she married your friend? Nicola was not my friend. Let's say your classmate, or, if you prefer, fellow student. Her last name was Formier at the time, and she lived in the chateau with her mother. It was not a real chateau. There had once been a chateau there, abutting the church, but only a few outbuildings remained. For perhaps a century and a half, doubtless ever since the Revolution, people had still been calling the place the chateau. Did you ever, before her marriage? No, Your Honor, not even a flirtation. Didn't you ever kiss her? It would never have crossed my mind. Why not? He almost replied, because she was too tall, and it was true. He could not have imagined this tall, impassive girl who reminded him of a statue ever making love. Besides, she was Mademoiselle Formier, the daughter of Dr. Formier, who had died during the wartime deportations. Was this explanation enough? He couldn't think of any other reason. The two of them had not belonged to the same circles. When they left school each afternoon with their satchels on their backs, she had only to cross the playground to be home in the heart of the village, whereas he and two friends walked on to La Boisselle, a tiny three-hearth hamlet near the Orneau Bridge. When you came back to Saint-Justin 4 years ago, married and a father, and you built your house there, did you contact her again? She had married Nicola and was running the grocery store with him. I bought something there now and then, but it was more often my wife who. Now, tell me how it began. He was driving past the place right now, at the edge of Bois de Sorel. It wasn't the day of the monthly cattle fair in Trient or the main market. Monday was the main market day, and there was a smaller market every Friday as well. He went to them regularly because it was a good way to meet his customers, because of his health. Nicholas did not drive. The magistrate knew that. It was Andrée who drove the Citroën to Trient every Thursday to purchase goods from various wholesalers. Every other Thursday, she stayed in town all day, adding a visit to the hairdressers. You must have run into her often during those 4 years. A certain number of times. Yes, one always meets people from Saint-Justin and Trient. Did you usually speak to each other in greeting, at a distance, or more personally? It depended. There were no other contacts between you. I must have asked occasionally how her husband was, or how she was doing, without any designs on her. Excuse me. This inquiry has revealed that in the course of your professional comings and goings, you indulged in a certain number of amorous adventures. Yes, like everyone else. Often, whenever I could. Among others, with Françoise, your brother's maid. Once, for fun, it was more like a joke. What do you mean? She dared me. I no longer remember the pretext. And one day, when I met her on the stairs, it happened on the stairs. Yes. Why did they sometimes look at him as if he were a cynical monster, and at other times freakishly naive? Neither of us took it seriously. Still, you did have intercourse, of course. You never felt like doing it again? No? Why not? Perhaps because right after that there was Andrée. Your brother's maid didn't resent you for this. Why would she? How different life is when one is living it from when one picks through it later on. In the end, he was unsettled by the feelings they ascribed to him, no longer knowing how to tell the true from the false, wondering what separated right from wrong. That encounter in September, for example, a Thursday, probably, since Andrée had gone to Trient, she must have been delayed at the hairdresser's or elsewhere, because she was going home later than usual, and it was growing dark. As for him, he had been obliged to have a few glasses of the local wine with some clients. He tried to avoid drinking, but in his job he could not always refuse a friendly round. He was feeling fine, light-hearted, as he had been when standing completely naked in front of the mirror in the blue room, staunching the bleeding from his lip. He had just turned on his headlights when he spotted Andrée's gray Citroën by the side of the road, and Andrée, in light-colored clothing, signaling him to stop. Quite naturally, he had, "It's a lucky thing you were passing by, Tony." Later they would ask him, as if it were an indictment against him. You were already on familiar terms. Ever since school, of course. Continue. Whatever could the magistrate have been writing on the typed sheet of paper in front of him? She said, "I end up with a puncture the one time I haven't room for the jack and leave it at home. You've got one, right?" He hadn't needed to take off his jacket because it was still so hot that he wasn't wearing one. He remembered that his open-necked shirt had short sleeves, and that his trousers were of blue twill. What else could he do but change the tire? Have you a spare? While he was working, night fell, and Andrée stood near him, handing him the tools. "You'll be late for dinner. You know, in my line of work, that's not unusual. Your wife doesn't say anything. She knows it isn't my fault. You met her in Paris, in Poitiers. She's from there, from a village close by. She worked in Poitiers. You like blondes?" Giselle was a blonde, with delicate, pearly skin that flushed pink at the slightest emotion. "I don't know. I've never thought about it. I was wondering if brunettes scared you." "Why?" "Because years ago, you kissed almost all the girls in the village, except me. I probably just didn't think of it." He was kidding around, wiping his hands off with his handkerchief. "You want to try, for once, to kiss me?" He had looked at her in amazement, tempted to say it again. Why? He couldn't see her clearly in the darkness. "You want to," she had repeated in a voice he had hardly recognized. He remembered the little red lights at the back of the car, the scent of the chestnut trees, then the smell, the taste of André's mouth. With her lips clinging to his, she grabbed his hand and guided it to her breast, which he was astonished to find so round, so heavy and alive. And he had thought of her as a statue. A lorry was coming, and, to avoid its headlamps, they drew back, still locked together, towards the ditch by the edge of the wood, where Andrée suddenly began to tremble the way no other woman he had known had ever done. Leaning on him with her whole body and saying over and over, "You want to," they had found themselves on the ground, in the tall grass and nettles. He told neither the policeman nor the magistrate. Only Professor Bigot, the psychiatrist, dragged the truth out of him. Bit by bit, she was the one who had pulled her skirt up over her belly and bared her breasts, commanding him in a voice as hoarse as a death rattle, "Fuck me, Tony." In fact, it was she who had possessed him, and her eyes had gleamed with as much triumph as passion. "I'd never suspected she was like that." "What do you mean?" "I'd thought she was cold, haughty, like her mother." Afterwards, she wasn't at all upset, lying still in the grass with her legs wide apart, as on that afternoon in the hotel room. She had said, "Thank you, Tony." She had seemed to mean it. She had looked humble, almost like a little girl. I've wanted to for so long. You see, ever since school, you remember Lynette Pichat, the girl with one eye a little crossed. It didn't stop you from running after her for months. Lynette now taught at a school in the Vendée region, and every year came home to spend her holidays with her parents. I caught you together once. You must have been 14, behind the brickyard. You haven't forgotten. He laughed. I haven't forgotten, because it was the first time. For her, too. I haven't a clue. I was too inexperienced to notice that. I hated her for months, in bed at night. I racked my brain for ways to make her suffer. Did you find any? No. I settled for praying that she'd get sick or be disfigured in an accident. We'd better be getting back to St. Justin. Wait a moment. Tony. No. Don't get up. We have to find a way to meet somewhere else. I go to Triant every Thursday. I know. Maybe your brother. The magistrate would later conclude, in short, as of that evening, it was all settled. It was hard to tell if he was being ironic. On 2nd August, the magistrate had not yet entered his life, and Tony drove on home. Night had not yet fallen. As it had in September, the sky was only just beginning to glow red in the west, and he had to dawdle a long time behind a herd of cows before he could pass them. A village in a hollow Doncoeur, then a gentle slope, more fields, meadows, a vast stretch of sky, and, after a rise in the road, the sight of his brand new house of pink brick, with the sun reflecting off one window. His daughter Marianne sitting on the doorstep, and at the far end of the property, the silvery shed where he stored farm machinery had his name emblazoned on it, just as it was on the van, which Marianne had already spotted in the distance. Twisting around, she must have been announcing into the house, "It's Pop." She refused to say Papa like the other children, and sometimes as a game, and perhaps because she was jealous of her mother, she called him Tony. Chapter 2. Halfway up a hill on the left was his house, surrounded by its garden, separated by a field from the old, gray, slate-roofed house of the Mollard sisters. Beyond it were the smithy, and finally, 100 meters further down, the village, with real streets, terrace houses, shops, and small cafes. The local people preferred to call it a market town. However, a large one of 1,600 inhabitants, not counting the 3 adjoining hamlets. You been fighting, Pop? He had forgotten André's bite. Your lips all swollen. I bumped into something. What? A lamppost in Triant. That's what happens when you forget to watch where you're going. Mama, Pop bumped into a lamppost. His wife came out of the kitchen in a small checked apron and carrying a saucepan. Is that true, Tony? It's nothing, as you can see. Mother and daughter looked so much alike that, when they stood side by side, it sometimes startled him. It wasn't too hot for you today. Not really. Now, I have to finish some work in the office. Can we eat at 6:30? I hope so. They ate early because Marianne went to bed at 8 o'clock. She had her own apron with little blue checks. She had just lost 2 front baby teeth, and the gaps gave her an almost pathetic expression. It was as if, for a few weeks, she were a child and a little old woman at the same time. Can I come with you, Pop? I promise not to make a noise. The office, with its pine shelves full of green boxes and piles of brochures, looked out on the road, and Tony was anxious to see the Citroën go by. Next door was what the architect had called the living room, the largest room in the house, intended to serve as both dining and sitting rooms. During the first week, they had discovered that it simply wasn't practical for Giselle to shuttle back and forth with the dishes, leaving the table to check food on the stove. And they had decided to eat in the kitchen. That room was large and cheerful. The scullery was used for washing and ironing. Everything was well planned, remarkably clean, never untidy. Your wife, I take it then, could be called an excellent housekeeper. Yes, Your Honor. Is that why you married her? When I married her, I didn't know that. Things had developed in 3 stages. Actually, if not 4. The first in Saint Justin, in his house, when the police sergeant, then the lieutenant, had hounded him with questions he found baffling. Then it was Inspector Mani's turn. In Poitiers, he specified dates, compared times, reconstructed Tony's comings and goings. At first, no one was interested in his thoughts and outlook. especially not the police. Or perhaps they simply found his private life unsurprising and basically like their own. With DM and then the psychiatrist, even his lawyer, all that would change. Whenever Tony appeared before the examining magistrate, for example, he arrived from prison in the police van that would soon ferry him back there. Whereas the magistrate went home for lunch or dinner, it was DM who made him the most uneasy, perhaps because they were about the same age. The magistrate was a year younger than Tony and had been married for a year and a half. His wife had just had their first baby. The magistrate's father, not a rich man, worked as an office manager in the Social Security Department, and DM had married a typist. They lived in a modest apartment, 3 rooms and a kitchen, in the newest neighborhood in town. Shouldn't they have been able to understand each other? What was it exactly that frightened you that night? What answer could he give? Everything, nothing in particular. Nicholas hadn't turned the shop over to his mother and taken the train for no good reason. He hadn't come to Tryon just to sit at a little table on the terrace of the Hotel des Voyageurs and drink some lemonade. When Tony had left the Blue Room, Andrée was still naked on the bed and showing no sign of going anywhere soon. Did you consider Nicolas a violent man? No. He was, however, a sick man who had been morose and withdrawn ever since childhood. Did you wonder, in Triant, if he might be armed? He hadn't thought of that. Were you afraid for your family? They weren't managing, he and DM, to use words that meant the same thing to them both, to place themselves on the same footing. They were always a little out of step with each other, pencil in hand before a pile of invoices. He pretended to work, now and then placing a meaningless cross next to a number to look busy. Sitting at his feet, his daughter was playing with a toy car that had lost a wheel. Beyond the lawn and the white fence, he could see the road about 20 meters away and across a meadow, the backs of some village houses, their yards and small gardens where dahlias were in bloom. In one spot, an enormous yellow sunflower with its black heart stood out brightly against a gray wall, near a barrel. When he had come home, he had automatically checked the clock, 5:45. At 6:20, Giselle came to ask him, Can I start serving now? Maybe a little later. I'd like to finish this before dinner. I am hungry. Pop, it won't take long. My pet, if I am late, you'll sit down to eat with Mama. It was around then that he felt flooded by a panic, unlike what he had felt earlier, when clutching his clothes and dashing upstairs in the hotel. This was a heart-wrenching, bodily anguish, an abrupt rush of fever that forced him to go and stand by the window. When he lit a cigarette, his hand trembled, his legs felt shaky. A presentiment. He spoke to the psychiatrist about it, or rather, Professor Bigot persuaded him to discuss it. That had never happened to you before. No, not even when by some miracle I survived a car accident unharmed. And yet that time, when I came to, sitting in a field without a scratch, I began to cry. Were you afraid of Nicholas? I always found him disturbing, somehow, even back in school. As luck would have it, just before 6:30, the Citroën appeared at the top of the rise. It drove past the house with Andrée at the wheel, her husband beside her, and neither of them looked in his direction. Ready when you are, Giselle. Then dinner is served. Go and wash your hands, Marianne. They had begun their evening meal as usual: soup, a ham omelette, salad, a camembert, and some apricots for dessert. Outside the windows lay the kitchen garden the couple tended together, where Marianne crouched for hours, pulling up weeds. The runner beans had reached the top of their poles. Behind the wire fencing of the hen house, at least a dozen white leghorn hens were pecking away. And there were shadowy forms in the rabbit hutches. The day seemed to be winding down like any other summer day. A mild breeze came in through the open window, with an occasional breath of cooler air. Fat Didier, the blacksmith, was still busy at his forge. Nature was calm and settling in for the night. Professor Bigot's questions almost always came out of the blue. Did you have the feeling, from that evening on, that you had lost her? Who, Andrée? He was nonplussed, because he hadn't thought of that at all. You'd been caught up for 11 months in what can certainly be called a grand passion. And that was not how he would have described it. He desired Andrée. After a few days without her, thoughts of their tumultuous, ardent hours together would haunt him with memories of her smell, her breasts, her belly, her boldness. Sometimes He lay awake next to Giselle for hours, tortured by incredible fantasies. What do you think about going to the cinema? What day is it? Thursday. Giselle was a little surprised. They usually went to the cinema once a week in Tryon, just 12 kilometers away. On other evenings, Tony would work in his office while his wife washed the dishes, then joined him to sew or darn socks while he worked. Now and then, they would pause to chat briefly, almost always about Marianne, who would be starting school in October. Once in a while, they would sit in front of their house, gazing out at the gathering dusk, the red and gray roofs in the moonlight, the dark mass of the trees with their barely whispering leaves. What's showing? An American film. I saw the poster, but can't remember the title. If you want to go, I'll tell the Mollards. When they went out in the evening, one or both of the Mollard sisters came to stay with Marianne. The eldest, Leonore, was 37 or 8. Marta was a bit younger, but they seemed of no particular age and would turn into old maids without anyone even noticing. Both had round, moon-like faces with indistinct features and wore the same dresses, the same coats, the same hats as some twins do. Often they were the sole worshippers at the 7 o'clock Mass, where they took communion every morning, and they never missed Vespers or Benediction. It was they who helped Father Louvet in the church, putting flowers on the altars, tending the cemetery, and they again who sat up with the dying and laid out the dead. They were seamstresses, and passers-by could see them working through their front window, where a big cafe au lait cat often lay napping on the sill. Marianne did not like them. They smell bad, she said. They did indeed have a particular odor about them, the one found in churches and dry goods stores, plus a hint of the smell in sick rooms. They're ugly. If they weren't here to take care of you, you'd be left alone in the house. I'm not scared. Giselle smiled her own little smile, a faint one that barely curved her lips, as if she were trying to keep it to herself. You ascribe that to her sense of discretion. Yes, Your Honor. What do you mean by that? Able to keep a secret. More words. That's not how I think of it. She didn't like to be noticed. She was afraid of taking up too much room, of disturbing people, of asking them any favors. Was she already like that as a child? I believe so. After a film or a dance, for instance, she would never have admitted that she was thirsty, so that I wouldn't have to spend more money. Did she have women friends? Only one, a lady neighbor older than she was, with whom she took long walks. What attracted you to her? I don't know. I never asked myself that. Did she seem safe and reassuring? Tony stared at the magistrate's face, trying to understand. I thought she would make. He couldn't find the right word. A good wife. That wasn't quite it. But he sighed and said, yes. Did you love her? And when there was no answer, did you want to sleep with her? Did you go to bed with her before your marriage? No, you didn't desire her. He must have, since he married her, and she. Do you think she loved you, or that it was the marriage itself that appealed to her? I don't know. I think. What would the magistrate have replied if he had asked him the same question? They made a good couple. That's all. Giselle was tidy, energetic, unassuming, the perfect housewife in their new house. He was glad to come home to her in the evenings, and until Andrée, he had never had any serious affairs. Even if he did take advantage of the odd opportunity. You maintain that you never considered a divorce. It's the truth. Not even during these last few months. Not for one moment. Yet you told your mistress. Then Tony suddenly raised his voice, even banged his fist on the little magistrate's desk without realizing it. But that's just it. I never actually said anything. She was the one talking. She was naked on the bed. I was naked in front of the mirror. The two of us. I mean, you know this as well as I do. In such moments, who worries about words? I could barely hear what she was saying. Listen for a good long while. I was watching a bee. He suddenly recalled the bee. He had even opened the shutters wider to let it fly out. I was nodding or shaking my head while thinking of other things. What, for example? It was too discouraging. He couldn't wait to get back to his prisoner cage inside the police van, where no one asked him any questions. I don't know. While Giselle dashed next door to alert the Mullard sisters, Tony put Marianne to bed, then showered and changed his underwear as he did whenever he had seen Andrée in Triumph. Isa Sam. There were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. If we have more children, we can put the boys in one bedroom and the girls in the other, Giselle had said when they were discussing the new house. After 6 years, they still had only Marianne and had used the 3rd bedroom just once. When Giselle's parents had visited Saint-Justin during the holidays, they lived in Montsartois, 6 kilometers from Poitiers. Germain Coutet, journeyman plumber, was a heavy man built like a gorilla, with a ruddy face, a booming voice, and he began every sentence with, "I've always said," or "what I think is." From day one, it was easy to see that he envied his son-in-law, envied him his bright, orderly office, the modern kitchen, and especially the gleaming shed where the machinery was kept. Me. I still think it's a mistake for a workman to branch out on his own. He opened his first bottle of red wine at 8 in the morning and drank all day long. He could be found loudly holding forth in all the village bistros and, although never drunk, would become increasingly categorical, even aggressive, as the day wore on. Who goes fishing every Sunday morning, you or me? So there who has 3 weeks of paid holidays and who doesn't need to come home at the end of the day and bust his brain over a bunch of numbers. His wife, fat, passive, with a prominent stomach, never challenged him. Could that explain why Giselle was so shy towards the end of their stay? There had been some heated arguments, and the Coutets spent no further holidays in Saint-Justin. After speaking to the Mollard sisters, Giselle had time to put away the dishes and even change her clothes. She barely seemed to move yet, never appeared to hurry as she went about her chores, which got done as if by magic, a last good night to Marianne. In the warm shadows of her room, downstairs, the Mullard ladies were already bending over their sewing. Have a good time. It was all very familiar, a scene so frequently repeated that they paid no attention to it any more. The engine started. Side by side in the front seat of the van, they left the village behind, where someone was working late in his garden while most others, sitting on chairs in front of their houses, were taking quiet advantage of the cool evening air. A few listening to a radio playing somewhere behind them in an empty room. They drove in silence at first, lost in their own thoughts. Tell me, Tony, When she paused, he felt a pang in his heart and wondered what would come next. Don't you think that for some time now, Marianne has been looking a touch pale? Their daughter had always been thin, with long arms, long legs, and her complexion had never been rosy. I spoke to Dr. Riquet about it earlier today, when I ran into him coming out of the grocery store. Hadn't she been surprised to see that Nicholas had vanished, leaving his mother behind the counter? Hadn't she thought it strange, as he says, we have nice fresh air, but children need change. He suggests that when we can, perhaps next year, we should take her to the seaside. He startled himself with the speed of his reply. Why not this year? She hardly dared believe it. Summer was Tony's busiest season, so they hadn't taken a single holiday since their move to St. Justin. They'd spent their savings on the property, but they would be paying off the house and machinery shed for a few years yet. You think we could, once, the first year of their marriage, while they were still in Poitiers, they had spent 2 weeks at Les Sables d'Olona, renting a furnished room from an old woman, where Giselle cooked their meals on an alcohol stove. It's already August. I'm afraid there won't be anything left. We'll go to the hotel. You remember that hotel? At the very end of the beach, a little before the pine woods. Les roches grises, no les roches noires. They had dined there one night on an enormous sole to celebrate Giselle's birthday, and the muscadet had made her a little tipsy. Tony was happy with his decision. He would be cutting off contact with Andrée and Nicolas for a while. When do you want to? I'll tell you later. Before, being absolutely sure about this holiday and choosing specific dates, he would have to speak to his brother. It was in order to see Vincent, in fact, that he was taking his wife to the cinema. He drove past the Hôtel des Voyageurs without stopping and turned into Rue Gambetta, where he found a parking space right outside the Olympia. On the pavement, one could tell the Parisians from the local people by the way they dressed, the way they walked and gazed at the lighted shop windows. Tony and Giselle always took the same seats, in the balcony. During the intermission after the newsreels, documentary, and cartoon, he suggested, how about a beer at Vincent's place? The terrace tables were almost all occupied, but Françoise found one for them and wiped it with her cloth. 2 beers. Françoise, is my brother here? At the bar, Monsieur Tony, inside the cafe. Men were playing cards in the yellowish light. Regulars whom Tony had seen 100 times sitting in the same corner, with the same customers to watch and comment on each play. Well, his brother answered in Italian, which was unusual, for they'd been born in France and had spoken Italian only with their mother, who had never managed to learn French. I'm not exactly sure what happened. I have the feeling that everything's fine. He was there on the terrace. I know. I saw him from upstairs. 10 minutes after you left, she came down, relaxed, as if she hadn't a care in the world, and crossed the cafe calling out, "Do thank your wife for me, Vincent." She was speaking loudly enough for her husband to hear. She left the same way, carrying her handbag. Just as she reached the corner of Rue Gambetta, she suddenly seemed to notice Nicholas well. "What are you doing here?" She sat down across from him, and I didn't hear the rest of their conversation. Did they seem to be arguing? No. At one point, she opened her bag and calmly applied fresh powder and lipstick. How did he seem? With him, it's hard to tell. You ever see him laugh? If you ask me, she got away with it. But if I were you, is Giselle here? On the terrace. Vincent went to say hello to her. The air was mild, the sky clear. An express train went through the station without stopping or slowing down in Rue Gambetta. Giselle placed her hand on her husband's arm, as she always did when out walking with him. "Is your brother pleased with how things are going? It's been a good season so far. There are more and more tourists every year." Vincent had not had to buy the building, but only the business, because the landlord, who had run the hotel before him and had retired to La Ciotat, did not want to sell, starting with nothing. The two brothers had managed quite well for themselves and had already come a long way. "Did you see Lucia?" "No. She must have been in the kitchen. I didn't have time to go and see her." He felt vaguely uneasy, and not for the first time. Giselle knew he had been in Trient that afternoon, yet had not asked him if he had seen his brother. At times he would have preferred that she ask him questions, painful though they might prove, since she helped him with his bookkeeping at the end of every month, and thus knew all about his business. Why wouldn't she be interested in what he did when he was off at work? Did she have suspicions? she preferred to keep to herself, they hurried back, for they could hear the bell inside the cinema signaling the end of the intermission, and others poured out of the little bar next door to join them. It was only on the way home, in the darkness of the car, as the headlamps flared across black and white landscapes like the ones in the film, that he suddenly announced, "Today is Thursday." The word alone made him blush. Did it not evoke the blue room? Andrée's voluptuous body, her spread thighs, her dark sex slowly oozing semen. "We could go on Saturday. I'll phone Les Roches Noires tomorrow. If they have 2 rooms, or even 1, and could supply a little bed for Marianne. Can you leave your work now? I could dash back here once or twice if necessary." He felt saved, realizing only now the danger from which he had escaped. "We'll stay there for 2 weeks, the 3 of us, lounging on the beach." Filled with a sudden wave of tenderness for his daughter, he blamed himself for not having noticed her pallor. He had wronged his wife, too, but through sins of omission. For example, he would never have been able to stop the car by the side of the road, take Giselle in his arms, press his face close to hers, murmuring, "I love you, you know." And yet the thought had crossed his mind. He had often considered it. He had never done it. What was he ashamed of? Wouldn't he have seemed like someone guilty and begging for forgiveness? He needed her. Marianne needed her mother, too. And he had betrayed them both when Andrée had asked him her questions. True. He had listened to them only distractedly, patting his lip with the damp towel. They were coming back to him now anyway, with cutting clarity, and he could even weigh the silence of her pauses. "You have a beautiful back." It was ridiculous. Giselle would never think of going into ecstasies over his back or his chest. "Do you love me, Tony?" In the overheated room, smelling of sex, such a question was only natural, whereas now, in the quiet night, as the van hummed along, the words and intonations became unreal. He had thought himself clever to reply grudgingly, "I think so." "You're not sure?" Did he think he was playing a game? Didn't he realize that for her it was so much more than that? Could you spend your whole life with me? She had asked that question twice in the space of a few minutes. Hadn't he already heard it during their previous encounters in the same room? Sure, he had replied, flying high, light in body and spirit. She had sensed so strongly that he wasn't speaking from his heart, that she had come at him again. Really sure, wouldn't you be afraid? What a fool he had been to say, with a clever glint in his eye. Afraid of what? The whole conversation was coming back to him, word for word. Can you imagine what our days would be like? She hadn't said nights, but days, as if she meant for them to spend all their time in bed. We'd get used to it in the end. Used to what? To us. And it was Giselle who sat next to him in the darkness, watching the same stretch of road, the same trees, the same telegraph poles surge out of the night only to hurtle into nothingness. He was tempted to take her hand, and he didn't dare. He would admit that one day to Dr. Bigot, who preferred to visit him in his cell rather than the prison infirmary. Although the guard brought him a chair, he sat on the edge of the bed. If I understand correctly, you loved your wife. Tony spread his hands wide, but simply said, yes. Only you were unable to reach her. He had never suspected that life could be so complicated. What did the psychiatrist mean? Exactly by reach her. They lived together like any married couple, didn't they? Why did you have no more children? After Marianne? I don't know. You didn't want any more. On the contrary, he would have wanted 6, a dozen, a house full of children, as in Italy. As for Giselle, she had talked about 2 or 3 boys and a girl, and they'd taken no precautions against a pregnancy. Did you often have sex with your wife? Mainly at the beginning. He spoke freely, without trying to hide anything. He had got caught up in this investigation and was as anxious as his interrogators to get to the bottom of it all. There was a period while she was pregnant, of course. When was that when you began seeing other women? I would have done that anyway. Is it some need you have? I don't know. All men are like that, aren't they? Professor Bigot was around 50, with a grown son studying in Paris, and a daughter recently married to a hematologist, for whom she worked as a lab assistant. The psychiatrist was untidy. wore loose-fitting, shabby clothes, on which a button often hung by a thread, and he was always blowing his nose as if suffering from a perpetual cold. How could he make this man understand that drive home in the night nothing special had happened? He and Giselle hadn't said much to each other. At that time, he had been certain that she knew nothing, nothing about that afternoon's events, at least, and probably nothing about his affair with Andrée. Even if she had heard rumors about a few other escapades. Yet it was while driving those 12 kilometers that he had felt the closest he ever had to her, the most deeply bound to her. It was on the tip of his tongue. I need you. Giselle needed her with him, needed her to believe in him. When I think of the years you cost me. It was not his wife's voice, but Andrée's, a little hoarse, from deep in her heaving chest, reproaching him for leaving the village when he was 16 to learn a profession elsewhere. He had gone to Paris and had worked in a garage until called up for military service. He had never paid any attention to Andrée. She was too tall. She lived in the chateau, and her father was a local hero, a cold, stuck-up girl, a statue. Why are you laughing? For he was driving along laughing, and not very pleasantly. I was remembering the film. Did you think it was good? As good as the rest of them. A statue that came strangely to life and asked him, with a faraway look in its eye, tell me, Tony, if I became free. Everyone knew that Nicholas was ill and would not make old bones, but that was no reason to talk about him as if he were as good as dead. He had pretended not to have heard her. Would you free yourself too? The train whistle had blown a furious blast. What did you say? I'm asking if, in that case, what would he have replied if he hadn't recognized Nicholas in the crowd from the station, coming across the square? The lights were on downstairs in their house, keeping track of the time. The Mullard sisters must have put away their sewing and got ready to go home, for they were usually in bed by 9 o'clock or even earlier. I'll put the van away. She got out and walked around to the back of the house to go in the kitchen door, while he went to park the van next to the massive bright red and yellow machines in the shed. As he came up to the house, the two sisters were leaving. Good night, Tony. Good night. Giselle was taking a last look around to see that everything was in order. Want something to drink? Are you hungry? No, thanks. Later, he would ask himself if at that moment she might have been waiting for some sign, some word from him. Was it possible that she had sensed a threat hanging over them after they had been to the cinema? She usually went directly up to check on Marianne's breathing. I know it's silly, she had admitted to him one evening. I only do it after I've been away from the house. When I'm here, I feel I'm protecting her, that we're protecting her. She added quickly, when I'm not with her, she seems so helpless to me. She would actually lean anxiously over her daughter until she could see her breathing evenly. He could think of nothing to say. They undressed facing one another, as they always did. Giselle's hips had broadened after childbearing, but she was still thin, otherwise, and her pale breasts sagged a little. How could he make others understand that he loved her when that evening, longing to pour out his feelings to her, he hadn't been able to make her understand that, "Good night, Tony. Good night, Giselle." She was the one who turned out the bedside lamp on her side, because she was always the first one up. And in the winter it was still dark. Wasn't she hesitating a moment? Before turning it off, he held his breath. Click. Chapter 3. He wasn't the nervous type. They had put him through enough tests in Poitiers to find that out first. The prison doctor had examined him, then the psychiatrist, and that strange woman, a psychologist with eyes like a gypsy, who seemed comical at times, but frightening at others. People tended instead to be amazed and even shocked at how calm he was, and someone in the courtroom, the assistant public prosecutor or the counsel for the plaintiff, would later describe his composure as cynical, even aggressive. It was true that he was usually in control of himself, more inclined to a wait-and-see attitude, preferring to remain on his guard instead of being more outgoing, more enterprising. Hadn't it been a happy time? Those 2 weeks at Les Sables d'Olonne. Happy and a bit sad. With sudden rushes of anxiety, he couldn't always hide from his wife and daughter. They were living like most summer holiday makers, having breakfast on the terrace, with Marianne already in her red bathing suit, and by 9 all 3 of them were at the beach, where they had quickly claimed their own private spot. In 2 days, they had established their habits and rituals. meeting their neighbors in the dining room of Les Roches Noires, smiling at the elderly couple at the table opposite theirs, who would wave affectionately at Marianne. As for Marianne, she was fascinated by the old gentleman's beard. If he leans any lower, his beard will land in his soup. She spied on him every evening, waiting for the inevitable. Every morning and afternoon, the same people would settle in under beach umbrellas all around them. The blonde lady who spent so much time putting on suntan oil before lying on her stomach, reading all day with her shoulder straps down, and the bad-mannered kids from Paris who stuck their tongues out at Marianne and pushed her out in the water. Giselle, unused to being at leisure, was knitting a sky blue pullover for their daughter to wear on her first day at school, her lips moving as she counted stitches. Was this holiday at the beach really turning out to be such a good idea? He played with Marianne, teaching her to swim, waist deep in the water, with his hand under her chin. He had tried to teach his wife, too, but as soon as she lost her footing, she would panic, flailing around and clutching at him. Once a wave had suddenly knocked her over, and she had shot him a look of, was it fear? Not fear of the sea, fear of him. For hours, he stayed calm, relaxed, playing ball, walking with Marianne to the end of the pier. They would all stroll together along the narrow streets of the town, visiting the cathedral, taking photos of the fishing boats at the docks, the local fishwives at the market in their pleated skirts and varnished wooden shoes. There were perhaps 10,000 tourists all doing the same things, and whenever a storm broke, they would snatch up their belongings to rush off to the hotels and cafes. Why, at times, did he seem to absent himself? Was he regretting having left Saint-Justin, where Andrée might be trying in vain to signal him? Now about this signal, Monsieur Falcone. After a few weeks in Poitiers, he was losing track of which questions had been Diem's and which the psychiatrist's. Sometimes they asked the same thing, with different words, in a different context. Weren't they getting together to compare statements between interrogations, hoping he would contradict himself in the end? When did you and your mistress establish this signal? That first evening. You mean in September, by the side of the road? Yes. Whose idea was it? Hers. I already told you. She wanted us to meet again somewhere else and thought right away of my brother's hotel. And the towel, Her first suggestion was to put a specific item in a corner of a shop window. There were two front windows displaying a jumble of groceries, cotton cloths, aprons, rubber boots. The Despierre store was on the main street, a few steps from the church, and everyone going through town had to pass it. It was dark inside, with barrels and crates piled against the walls. Both counters stacked high with merchandise. Shelves brimming with bottles and cans, drill trousers, wicker baskets, and hams hanging from the ceilings. The smell of this shop was the strongest, most evocative scent of his entire childhood, with that high note from the cans of kerosene, for the isolated farms and hamlets did not yet have electricity. What item? She'd thought of a packet of starch. Then she was afraid that her husband might move it without her noticing while she was off in the kitchen. How could they hope to learn in a few hours a day, over weeks or even months? Everything they needed to know about a life so different from theirs, not only his life and Giselle's, but the lives of Andrée, Madame Despierre, Madame Formier, the life of the village, the back and forth between Tryon and Saint-Justin. Simply to understand the Blue Room, they would have had to. In the end, she decided that on the Thursdays, when she could join me in the hotel, she would set a towel out to dry on her windowsill. Their bedroom window, hers and Nicholas. For they did sleep in the same room. It was over the shop, one of the three narrow windows with safety bars, the one in which a lithograph in a black and gold frame could be glimpsed in the dim light, hanging on the muddy brown wall, so that every Thursday morning I passed her house. Who knows whether, while he was living in a bathing suit on the beach, perhaps Andrée was signaling him for help, and the towel was permanently draped on the safety bar. True, he had seen her and Nicolas driving home from Trient in the Citroën, but he knew nothing about their state of mind. I wonder, Monsieur Falcone, whether, in suggesting that holiday to your wife, she had just mentioned Marianne's poor color. I'm aware of that. You did seize the opportunity, a chance, perhaps to reassure her, to play the good husband, the loving father, to allay her suspicions. What do you think of that explanation? It isn't true. You continue to claim that your intention was to get away from your mistress. He hated that word, yet he had to put up with it. That's about it. You'd already decided not to see her again. I hadn't any definite plan. Have you seen her again during the intervening months? No, she never signaled to you again. I have no idea, because from then on, I avoided going by her house on Thursday mornings. And you did so simply because one afternoon you saw her husband walk from the station to the hotel terrace to sit there drinking lemonade. She is the only woman, by your own admission, with whom you have experienced the fulfillment of physical love. You described it, as I recall, as a revelation. That was true, even if he hadn't used that particular word, at Les Sables d'Olonne. Sometimes he found himself thinking about the blue room against his will, gritting his teeth with desire. At other times, he could be unreasonable, impatient, scolding Marianne for a trifle, or withdrawing into himself, with a hard look in his eye. Giselle and her daughter would look at each other, the mother seeming to tell her child, "Pay no attention. Your father has things on his mind." A moment later, were they not just as uneasy when he abruptly became exaggeratedly patient, gentle, and affectionate? Are you ambitious, Monsieur Falcone? He had to think about that, since he never had before. Are there really people who spend their lives looking at themselves in a mirror and asking themselves questions about themselves? Depends on what you mean by that. At 12, I worked after school and during the holidays to buy myself a bicycle. Later, I dreamed about having a motorbike. I went to Paris. When I married Giselle, I started thinking about having my own business. In Poitiers, the firm I worked for assembled agricultural machinery shipped in pieces from America, and I was earning a good living. Your brother set up on his own, too, after trying out several trades. What connection could there be between their two careers? It wasn't DM, but Professor Bigot speaking, slowly, as if musing aloud. I wonder if the fact that your parents were Italian, so that you were both foreigners in a French village. I've been told your father was a bricklayer. The magistrate had spent an entire afternoon questioning the elder Falcone, seeking him out in his cottage in La Boisselle. What do you know about your father? He came from Larina, a very poor village in the Piedmont region, about 30 kilometers from Vercelli, out there where the mountains can't support everyone. Most boys emigrate, and my father did the same. When he was 14 or 15, he came to France with a crew that dug a tunnel. I don't know which one, somewhere near Limoges. Then he traveled around, worked on other tunnels. It was difficult to talk about Angelo Falcone, whom everyone in Saint-Justin called Old Angelo, for he was different, somehow, from other men. He traveled a lot in France, north, south, east, west, and finally settled down in La Boisselle. Even now, Tony remembered it as an astonishing place. 2 or 3 kilometers from Saint-Justin, La Boisselle had been a monastery built on the site of an ancient fortress and constructed from its very stones. One could still see sections of the old walls among the rampant weeds and remnants of the moat, filled with stagnant water, where he had fished for frogs. The monks had probably practiced agriculture, for around the large courtyard there remained buildings of all kinds, stables, workshops, and wine-press sheds. The Coutant family occupied most of the area, with about a dozen cows, some sheep, 2 draft horses, and an old billy goat that chewed tobacco. They rented out whatever buildings they didn't need, if they were still habitable. And these formed a motley little colony comprising, aside from the Falcones, a Czech family and some people from Alsace with their 8 children. Your father wasn't that young anymore when you were born. He was 43, 44 when he returned to his Piedmontese village and brought my mother back with him. In other words, he decided it was time for him to marry, and he went home to find a wife. I believe that's what happened. His mother's maiden name had been Maria Passaris, and when she arrived in France, she was 22 years old. Were they a happy couple? I never heard them argue. Did your father keep working as a bricklayer? That was all he knew, and it never occurred to him to do anything else. You were born first, and your brother Vincent came along 3 years later. Then my sister Angelina. Does she live in Saint Justin? She died at an early age. At 6 months, my mother had gone to Tryon. I don't know why. Before she came to France, she had never left her village. Here, in a country where she didn't speak the language, she rarely left the house. That day, in Tryon, it's thought that she opened the wrong door by mistake and got out of the train on the wrong side. She and the baby in her arms were run down by an express. How old were you? 7. My brother was 4. Was it your father who raised you? Yes. When he got home from his job, he did the cooking and housework. I didn't know him well enough from before to know if the accident changed him. What do you mean? You know perfectly well. Didn't you speak with him? There was an edge in Tony's voice now. Yes. And what do you think? Are the people around here right? Is my father simple? In St. Justin, no one said simple-minded, just simple was enough. Embarrassed. Bigot merely gestured vaguely in reply. I don't know if you got anything out of him. For years, we never heard him speak, my brother and I, unless it was absolutely necessary. At 78, he lives alone in the house where we were born and still does a little bricklaying here and there. He refuses to come live with me or Vincent. His only distraction is building a miniature village in his tiny garden. He began working on it 20 years ago. The church is less than a meter high, but it's complete to the last detail. You can see the inn, the town hall, a bridge over a stream, a watermill, and every year he adds a house or two. Seems it's a faithful reproduction of Larina, that village he and my mother came from. He did not say what he really thought. His father was an uncouth man of limited intelligence who had been content to live alone until he was past 40. Tony could see pretty well why he had gone back to Larina to seek a wife. In his way, Angelo Falcone had loved Maria Passaris, who was young enough to be his daughter, not with words or grand shows of affection, because he was a man who kept things to himself. When she had died along with his daughter, Angelo Falcone had withdrawn into himself for good and had soon begun building his strange toy village in the garden. He isn't crazy, exclaimed Tony fiercely. He could guess what some people must think, including, perhaps, this Professor Bigot. And I'm not crazy either. There has never been any question of that. Oh, then why are you still grilling me for the 6th or 7th time? Because the newspapers are calling me a monster. But this still lay in the future. At Les Roches Noires, people lived on the beach, with the taste of sand in their mouths and sand in their beds and pockets. It rained only twice in 2 weeks. The sun dazzled everyone's eyes and skin to the point of vertigo, especially if they stared a long time at the white-crested waves rolling slowly in from the open sea, one after another, until they crashed into a spray of a myriad sparkling drops. Marianne got a touch of sunburn. After a few days, Tony was brown enough that when he undressed at night, his pale skin shade the shape of his bathing suit. Only Giselle, who stayed under the beach umbrella, still looked the same as always. What was happening in Saint-Justin? In the Despierres' gloomy shop, and in the evening, in the bedroom where Andrée and Nicolas undressed in front of each other, the pink-edged towel wasn't it, draped over the guardrail as a signal of alarm, and Nicholas's stony-faced mother, had she not crossed the garden to take the situation in hand and take revenge at last on her daughter-in-law? They thought. All these people in Poitiers, policemen, magistrates, doctors, even that unnerving lady psychologist, that they were going to establish the truth when they knew almost nothing about the Despierres, the Formiers, and so many others who were important in their own ways. And Tony, what did they know about him? Less than he did. Right, Madame Despierres was certainly the most important and imposing personage in Saint-Justin, eclipsing even the mayor, a wealthy cattle merchant in his own right, in a village where men and women of the same generation had all gone to the same school together. Few dared call her Germaine, much less address her familiarly. To everyone, she was Madame Despierres. Tony must have been mistaken, for she was barely 30 when he had begun purchasing things for his parents at the grocery store. But he remembered her hair being just as gray then as it was now. Behind her counter, she wore a gray smock, leaving her chalk-white face as the only pale spot. He had known her husband, a puny man with a hesitant manner and a timorous expression, wearing a pince-nez and a smock that was too long for him. Sometimes he would start swaying, and his wife would hustle him into the room behind the store, closing the door on the customers, glancing knowingly at one another and shaking their heads. Tony had been hearing talk about the falling sickness well before he understood that Despierres suffered from epilepsy, and that, behind the closed door, he was thrashing convulsively, lying on the floor with his jaws clenched and drool streaking his chin. He could recall the man's funeral and following his procession with all the other school children in little rows, save for Nicolas, who was with his mother at the front of the mourners. They were said to be very rich and very stingy, Not only did they own several houses in town, but two large farms as well, worked by tenant farmers, plus the hamlet of La Guipotte. Monsieur Falcone, why did you choose to settle in Saint-Justin, which you had left more than 10 years earlier? Hadn't he already answered that question? They repeated the same things to him so often that he just didn't know anymore. He must be contradicting himself at times, for he himself did not have the answers to these whys and hows. Maybe it was because of my father. You hardly saw him. About once a week, old Angelo had come to his house 2 or 3 times, but had seemed ill at ease. Giselle was a stranger to him, and he was uncomfortable around her. Tony preferred to go to La Boissière every Saturday evening. The door would stay open. They did not light the lamp. They listened to the frogs croaking in the marsh, and the two men sitting on straw-bottomed chairs. Let the time pass without a word. Don't forget that my brother was already established in Triant. You're sure you didn't come back for Andrée? That again, you were aware of her marriage to your former classmate Nicholas. No, that had come as a surprise. There was a vast gulf between the Despierres and the Formiers, and the two mothers, although close in age, came from different worlds. While Madame Despierres was the very model of a nouveau riche peasant, the wife of Dr. Formier was typical of a certain provincial bourgeoisie fallen on hard times and refusing to lose face. Her father had been a notary at Villers-les-Hauts, and the Bardave family men, from father to son, had been socializing with the local gentry for so long, hunting and playing bridge with them, that they'd come to think of themselves as gentry too. André's grandfather had bequeathed nothing to his children, and neither had her father. Dr. Formier had left his wife and daughter an annuity so modest that, although they still lived in the chateau and dressed like townspeople, they did not always have enough to eat. Which of them, Madame Despierres or Madame Formier, had proposed this marriage to the other one? Was it the proud, spiteful widow with her grocery store, or the bourgeoise anxious to see her daughter safe from want, knowing that she would be rich one day, and probably before long at school, Nicholas seems to have been bullied by his classmates. True and false, like all the rest of it. Sickly, often plagued by stomach aches, unable to join his classmates' games. Nicholas had been fated to become a laughingstock for the other boys. They called him a sissy, a fraidy cat, accused him of clinging to his mother's skirts, even worse, unable to defend himself. He reported to the principal all the tricks the kids played on him. Tony hadn't belonged to the gang that harassed him. He wasn't any better than they were. Perhaps, but as a foreigner, he was a bit of an outsider himself. Once during their break time, and once more, when school was letting out, he had come to the defense of Nicholas, whom he did not yet know was ill. The boy had had his first fit at the age of 12 and a half, out of nowhere, in the middle of a class. There had been the sound of a body falling to the floor, and as his classmates began turning around, the teacher had slapped his desk with a ruler. Nobody move. It was spring. The chestnut trees in the playground were in flower. There had been swarms of Maybugs that year, and all eyes had been on them as they flew clumsily around the classroom, bumping into windows and walls. In spite of the teacher's order, the children stared at Nicholas, their faces blanching, and some were so frightened they began to feel sick. Everybody go to the playground. There had been a general stampede outside, but the bravest kids soon crept up to the windows to watch the teacher force his handkerchief into Nicholas's mouth. One of them had raced to the grocery store, and it wasn't long before Madame Despierre arrived in her eternal gray smock. The children outside pestered those at the window. "What's going on?" "Nothing. They're leaving him on the floor. He must be dying." There were a lot of guilty consciences that day. "You think he ate something bad for him." "No. Seems his father had the same fits." "Are they catching?" 15 or 30 minutes later, they had lost track of time. Madame Despierre left through the playground, holding the hand of her son, who looked bewildered but otherwise the same as usual. He had never had another fit at school, as far as Tony knew. He could almost always sense one coming, sometimes several days in advance, and his mother would keep him home. No one ever spoke of this in front of Madame Despierre, and certainly not in her store, without knowing why. Everyone considered the malady something to be ashamed of. Nicholas had not gone to upper school in Trient, nor had he done any military service or even gone to any dances. He had never had a bicycle or a motorbike, and he did not drive the Citroen. Sometimes he wouldn't speak for a week. Sullen, suspicious. He would look at people as if they wished him harm. He drank neither liquor nor wine, and his stomach could tolerate only bland food. Hadn't Tony been disturbed by the thought of him that September evening, there with Andrée half naked by the roadside? Weren't you more or less aware of resenting him because he was rich? He shrugged, naturally, before he had learned that Nicholas was ill, before that first fit in school. He had envied him in a childish way. He had dreamed of jars of rainbow-colored sweets and the biscuits in the glass-topped tins that Nicholas, he imagined, could simply raid at will, whereas he could afford just the cheapest sweets, and only now and then. When you learned of his marriage, didn't you think that he had in some way bought Andrée, or that his mother had bought her for him? Perhaps he had felt a little contemptuous of the statue because he refused to believe that she had married for love. After thinking about it, he had felt sorry for her. As a child, he had sometimes gone hungry, too, but he hadn't lived in the chateau or felt obliged to keep up a front. He had no idea how the marriage had been arranged. From what he knew of the two mothers, each must have imposed her own conditions. They lived almost across from each other. The chateau was to the right of the church, near the presbytery, across the square, on the corner of Rue Neuve. The Despierre grocery store was backed by the town hall and the school. Although people still talked about the elaborate white wedding and the banquet at the inn, the newlyweds had not gone on a honeymoon, but spent that night, and every night thereafter, in the bedroom over the shop. As for Madame Despierre, she had moved into a small cottage next to the garden, about 20 meters from the couple's home. At first, the two women worked behind the counter, and the mother continued to do the cooking. An elderly local woman, wearing men's shoes, came every day to clean. The whole town was watching Madame Despierre and Andrée, and soon it was obvious that they spoke to each other only about business matters. Later, the mother began eating her meals in the cottage. Finally, after a few months, she ceased to appear in the store or the house, and her son began going through the garden 2 or 3 times a day to see her. Did this mean that Andrée had won the battle? Had she resolved, when she got married, to gradually supplant her mother-in-law? Tony had been with Andrée in the Blue Room 8 times, and he had never thought of asking her about it, preferring not to know, not to think too much about this other life of the naked and wanton woman he knew so well. He vaguely sensed a vital truth he could not manage to express. It informed, he felt, what was said on 2nd August. That fatal August day he had experienced so simply, never suspecting how much would later be made of it, including fodder for front-page news. A reporter from a major Parisian paper would even launch a phrase adopted by all his colleagues, "they frenzied lovers." "Would you like to spend your whole life with me?" Sure. He had said that. He did not deny it. He was the one who had reported that conversation to the magistrate. But the important thing was his tone of voice. He was just talking, without meaning anything by it. It wasn't real. In the Blue Room, nothing was real. Or rather, its reality was of a different nature, incomprehensible anywhere else. He had tried to explain this to the psychiatrist, and at the time, Bigot had seemed to understand. But a bit later, through some question or remark, he had shown that he hadn't understood at all. If Tony had been thinking about living with her, he wouldn't have said, "Sure." He hadn't the slightest idea what he would have replied, but he would have found other words. Andrée had rightly sensed that, for she had pressed him on it. "Really sure? Wouldn't you be afraid?" Afraid of what? Can you imagine what our days would be like? We'd get used to it in the end. Used to what? Was that real life? Would he have spoken like that to Giselle Andrée? Sprawled sated on the bed, was playing the game along with him? To us, precisely. They were us, only in a bed. In the Blue Room, they strove in a kind of frenzy, to use that journalist's word, to impregnate with their odor. They had never been a couple elsewhere, except when they made love the first time, in the tall grass and nettles beside Bois de Sorel. If you didn't love her, how do you explain what did they mean by love? Could Professor Bigot, who prided himself on his scientific credentials, have defined that word for him? His daughter had just got married. How did she love her husband? And the little magistrate, Monsieur Diem, with his halo of unruly hair. His wife had recently given him his first child. And, like all young fathers, he must have had, like Tony, to get up at night to bottle feed the baby. What kind of love did he feel for his wife to answer their questions? Tony would have had to tell them things that don't bear talking about. Moments like those he had experienced at Les Sables d'Olonne. Why choose Les Sables over some beach in Brittany or the Vendée? Because that's where we went during the first year of our marriage. So, your wife may have thought that it was a pilgrimage, that this spot had some sentimental value for you. Isn't that exactly what you would have done if you were trying to allay her suspicions? All he could do was bite his tongue and boil with anger inside. It was useless to fight back. Could he tell them about the last day at the shore first? That morning, lying under the beach umbrella. Sometimes he would glance through half-closed eyelids at his wife, sitting in a striped deck chair, hurrying to finish the sky-blue pullover. "What are you thinking about?" she had asked him. "You." "And just what are you thinking?" "That I was lucky to meet you." It wasn't the whole truth. Behind him, he could hear Marianne pretending to read the text of a picture book, and he had been reflecting that in 12 or 15 years, she would be in love. She would get married. She would leave them to share the life of a man, of a stranger. In effect, because it takes more than a few months, or 2 or 3 years, for a married couple to really know each other. That's how he had arrived at Giselle. He was watching her knit, relaxed, focused. Just when she had asked her question, he had been wondering what she was thinking. To tell the truth, he did not know what she thought of him, how she saw him, how she judged his actions. They had been married for 7 years, so he had then tried to imagine their life to come. They would gradually grow old. Marianne would become a young lady. They would attend her wedding. One day, she would tell them that she was expecting, and when the baby arrived, they would take second place behind the father. Wouldn't that be the moment when he and Giselle would truly love each other? Don't couples take long years to learn how to know each other, sharing many memories, ones like those of this very morning? They were living now. They must have been thinking along the same lines, because shortly afterwards his wife murmured, "It feels strange to think that Marianne is already heading off to school. and he was all the way up to her wedding. Their daughter sensed that she could get away with anything at the beach and was taking complete advantage of her father that afternoon more than ever. She never left him alone for a minute. The tide was out, the distant sea beyond reach for more than an hour. He had to help Marianne build an enormous fortress in the sand. Or, rather, he had to follow her orders. And, like old Angelo in his garden, she kept demanding one more thing: a moat, a ditch, a drawbridge. Now, let's go and find shells to pave the courtyard and the paths outside. Watch out for the sun. Put on your hat. They'd bought her a Venetian gondolier's hat in a seaside shop. Giselle didn't dare add, "Don't wear your father out." Each carrying a red pail, they had traipsed the entire length of the beach. Father and daughter, heads down, eyes peeled for the gleam of a shell in the brown sand, sometimes tripping over the leg of a stretched out sunbather, or nimbly avoiding a beach ball. Did he feel he was fulfilling a duty, earning forgiveness for some failing, atoning for a fault committed? In all honesty, he would not have known. What he did know was that this walk in the sunshine, accompanied by the fluting voice of his daughter, was both melancholy and sweet. He was happy and sad, not because of Andrée or of Nicola. He didn't remember giving them a thought. He would freely have said happy and sad like life itself. When they turned around, to the sound of the music from the nearby casino, the way back looked long, and their goal distant, especially to Marianne, who began dragging her feet, tired, a little. "You want me to carry you on my shoulders?" She had laughed, revealing the gap in her teeth. "I am too big." When she had been 2 or 3, that had been her favorite game. He had always carried her up to bed at night that way. "People will laugh at you," she added, sorely tempted. He had hoisted her up, and since she was holding on to his head, he carried both the pails. "I'm not too heavy." "No." "Is it true I'm skinny?" "Who says so?" "Roland." He was the blacksmith's son. "He's a year younger than me, and he weighs 25 kilos. Me, I only weigh 19. I got weighed before we left. On the scale at the grocery store. Boys are heavier than girls." "Why?" Pensively, Giselle watched them approach, perhaps with a pang in her heart. He set his daughter down on the sand. "Help me add the shells." "Don't you think you're overdoing it? Marianne, your father is here to rest. He has to go back to work the day after tomorrow. He's the one who wanted to carry me." Their eyes had met. It's the last day of holiday for her, too, he had said lightly in her defense. Giselle had said nothing further, but he thought he had glimpsed a grateful look in her eye. Grateful for what? For having devoted himself for 2 weeks to both of them. It seemed only natural to him. Chapter 4, Blue Light. Tony Falcone entered the blue room, a familiar space that still made his heart race. Blue light illuminated familiar objects, bringing back memories both sweet and confusing for Andrée. Andrée stood by the window, her eyes both curious and challenging. Tony realized that her every move was both seductive and threatening. Outside, unfamiliar footsteps echoed in the hallway. Tony realized that Nicholas could appear at any moment, forcing him and Andrée to choose between staying or hiding. The two exchanged knowing glances. The blue room was not only a place for warm encounters, but also a psychological test, a balance between desire, secrecy, and risk. Green light, darkness, secrets, and risks converge. Tony's next move will determine his and André's fate, and secrets could be revealed at any moment. Chapter 5, The Chase. Footsteps echoed down the hallway into the blue room, making Tony and Andrée hold their breath. They both knew Nicholas was approaching, his eyes scrutinizing their every move. Andrée moved silently toward the window, her eyes both tense and alert. Tony realized that every small move could give away the secret, and they had to coordinate perfectly to avoid detection. Outside, the wind and rain added to the tension. Every step, every sound made their hearts beat faster. Tony had to weigh the need to stay with Andrée against the risk of Nicholas finding out. The blue light from the room illuminated Tony's tense but determined face, while Andrée gave him a knowing look. They walked slowly, both cautious and determined. Light and darkness, truth and secret, power and desire converge. Each next move will determine the fate of Tony and Andrée on this dangerous night. Chapter 6, The Turning Point. The blue room was bathed in a dim blue light. Every object sharpened, and both sensual and suspicious. Tony and Andrée stood facing each other, hearts pounding, aware that every minute was a test. Outside in the hallway, Nicholas's footsteps grew closer. Tony knew that even the slightest mistake could ruin everything and reveal the secret to Giselle or the others. Andrée leaned in, her gaze both intense and seductive, forcing Tony to balance desire and wariness. The heat and suspense combined to create a moment both sweet and dangerous. They moved deftly, keeping calm but maintaining a delicate connection. The blue room becomes a testing space where desire, secrecy, and risk mingle. Blue light, darkness, power, and desire converge. Each of Tony and André's next moves will determine the outcome of the night, opening or closing doors of opportunity, and determining whether the secret will be discovered. Chapter 7. Tense night. Tony and Andrée stood close together in the blue room, the blue light illuminating their tense but determined faces. Every small gesture had to be considered because Nicholas could appear from the dark hallway at any moment. Outside, the rain and wind blew against the windows, creating a mixture of soothing and terrifying sounds. Tony felt the pressure, the intense desire, and the risk of being discovered mixed together, making his heart pound. Andrée gave Tony a knowing look. They moved deftly, maintaining a subtle connection while keeping a safe distance to avoid any openings. The blue room becomes a hub of tension, a place where desire, secrets, power, and risk collide. Tony realizes that just one wrong decision could expose Giselle or the others. Blue light, darkness, truth, and secrets converge. Every step Tony and Andrée take tonight will determine not only their safety, but the fate of their relationship. Chapter 8. Danger is near. The blue room was bathed in a soft blue light, highlighting every detail of the room and reflecting on Tony's tense face. Andrée stood close, her gaze both shy and seductive, creating a delicate balance between desire and danger. Outside in the hallway, Nicholas's footsteps became clearer. Tony realized that their every move was being watched, and that the slightest mistake could expose their secret to Giselle or the others. Tony and Andrée exchanged sympathetic glances, understanding that they had to work together in harmony, keeping their distance while maintaining a delicate connection. The blue room was now not only a place for warm encounters, but also a space for intellectual, instinctive, and emotional challenges. Blue light, darkness, power and desire converge. Every action, every step Tony and Andrée take is decisive, opening or closing opportunities and determining their fate on this dangerous night. Chapter 9. Climax. The wind and rain outside the window created a rhythmic but tense sound, mixed with the dim blue light of the blue room. Tony stood near Andrée, his heart pounding, feeling the tension and the intense desire. Outside in the hallway, Nicholas was getting closer, each footstep echoing, forcing Tony and Andrée to stay absolutely calm. Every little move could reveal secrets and cause trouble for Giselle or the others. Andrée moved closer, her eyes challenging and understanding. Tony realized that in this moment, they were not only facing social and legal risks, but also having to control their emotions, maintaining a delicate connection. The blue room becomes a crucial space. Desire, secrets, power, and risk mingle, and every move matters. Tony and Andrée must weigh every move to avoid ruining everything, while keeping safe and protecting the secret. Blue light, darkness, and truth converge. Tonight's climax will determine the fate of their relationship. Safety and undisclosed secrets. Chapter 10. Climax. The blue room was bathed in a dim blue light, reflecting off Tony's tense but determined face. Andrée stood close by, her gaze both cautious and passionate, striking a delicate balance between desire and risk. Nicholas's footsteps grew closer, as if emphasizing that every little move was being watched. Tony knew that one slip-up could expose the secret to Giselle or those around him. They exchanged knowing glances, coordinating skillfully, keeping a safe distance while maintaining a subtle connection. The blue room was now a place where intelligence, instinct, and emotion were challenged, where desire and danger intertwined. Blue light, darkness, power, and secrets converge. Every action, every step that Tony and Andrée take now will determine the fate of the night, their relationship, and their ability to protect their secrets from social and legal dangers. Chapter 11. The end. Dawn light filtered through the blue room windows, illuminating Tony Falcone's tired but determined face. The long, tense night had ended. the immediate dangers from Nicholas, society, and the secret that had yet to be revealed had temporarily subsided. Tony looks back at the entire sequence, every decision, every subtle action to protect himself, maintain control of his relationship with Andrée, and protect his own secret. He realizes that intelligence, calmness, and observation are the lights that guide him through darkness and danger. Tony and André's relationship is now deep trusting, tense, and mysterious. They both know that the secrets are not yet fully revealed, but cooperation and alertness will help them overcome any challenge. Giselle and the other supporting characters retreat, but the dangers of society, the law, and hidden conspiracies remain. Tony knows that sobriety, intelligence, and vigilance will always be the weapons that guide the next challenges. Life, power, and secrets go hand in hand, and Tony Falcone, fresh from a long and tense night, will continue to walk between light and darkness, ready to face the risks, complex relationships, and challenges ahead.